Darren Jacobs leaned against a street lamp, hands shoved deep in the pockets of his worn-out hoodie, watching the bright red food truck he had spent years building from the ground up. From the outside, everything looked normal. Customers lined up. The sizzling of burgers echoed from the griddle, and the smell of garlic butter fries filled the air. But something felt off. He had bought the company 8 years ago from an old family-run business and turned it into a growing brand with 8 trucks spread across the state. At first, he had been hands-on, working the grills, training staff, even taking late-night shifts. But as the business expanded, he had pulled back to focus on the bigger picture, trusting his district managers to handle day-to-day operations. Lately, though, complaints had been piling up. Cold food, rude service, long wait times. The reports didn't match the brand he had built. Every time he asked his district manager, he got the same answer. "Just a few bad days, boss. Nothing to worry about." He wasn't buying it. That's why he was here, disguised as just another customer. He had grown out his beard, dyed his hair a darker brown, and threw on clothes that made him look like a local construction worker on break. No one working this truck had ever met him personally. He had only seen their names on payroll reports. He stepped forward in line, the cashier barely making eye contact as she muttered, "What do you want?" Darren glanced at her name, tag Melinda. Her bored tone and expression told him everything he needed to know. "I'll take a bacon cheeseburger and garlic fries," he said, handing her cash. "No substitutions, no refunds," she said flatly, snatching the bills without another word. Darren moved aside, listening as the next customer got the same dismissive treatment. He felt his jaw clench. As he waited, 2 college students behind him laughed as they scrolled through their phones at the nearby high-top table. "Dude, did you hear about that guy who got food poisoning from this truck last week?" one of them said. "No way. I believe it. Every time I come here, the fries are cold and the workers act like they hate their lives," the other replied. Darren froze. Food poisoning? That had never been reported to corporate. His stomach twisted as the first student kept talking. "My roommate works here. He said the manager, Travis, doesn't care about health codes. Like, he'll straight up tell them to serve old food if they're running low instead of making a fresh batch." Darren's hands clenched into fists. If that was true, it wasn't just bad service, this was dangerous. His order was shoved onto the counter with zero effort. The burger looked like it had been slapped together in a hurry, the cheese barely melted. He picked up a fry stone cold. That was it. This wasn't just a bad day. This was a disaster, and it was time to see just how deep the problem went. Darren took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He hadn't come here to explode in anger. He needed to understand exactly what was going wrong before making any moves. He carried his tray to a standing table near the side of the truck, pretending to pick at his food while keeping an eye on the employees inside. The cashier, Melinda, had already turned her attention to her phone, tapping away with total disinterest while customers waited at the register. A man working the grill, likely Travis, based on the college guy's comment, barely glanced at the patties as he flipped them. Grease pooled around the edges of the griddle, and Darren noticed a stack of buns sitting open on the counter, clearly stale from exposure. A man in a grease-stained apron emerged from the back of the truck, carrying a plastic bin. He scooped fries directly from it into the fryer without checking them. Darren's stomach twisted when he realized some of them were greenish, likely old and improperly stored. A customer near the pickup station frowned at his meal. He hesitated before calling over Melinda, who rolled her eyes and trudged to the counter. "This burger's raw in the middle," the man said, holding up the sandwich. Melinda barely glanced at it before responding, "That's how we make them." Darren's jaw tightened. That was a blatant lie. His company had strict rules to ensure food safety. Burgers were supposed to be cooked to at least medium well, unless the customer specifically requested otherwise. The customer sighed. "I'm not trying to argue, just want it cooked a little longer." Melinda turned toward the grill. "Travis, he says it's raw." Travis didn't even look up. "Not my problem, tell him to eat around it." Darren felt his pulse spike. He had built this business with a promise of great food and great service. Watching it crumble into this kind of indifference made his stomach churn. The customer shook his head, clearly frustrated. "Forget it." He tossed the burger in the trash and walked off. Darren had seen enough for now. He left his untouched food behind and walked a short distance down the street before pulling out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the district manager, Greg. When Greg picked up, Darren kept his tone neutral. "How's the downtown truck doing?" "Solid," Greg replied without hesitation. "Great numbers, no complaints." Darren's hand tightened around the phone. "You're sure?" "Yeah, man," Greg said. "Travis runs a tight ship. Customers love it." Darren felt a flash of anger but forced it down. He wasn't going to get the truth over the phone. He needed to see how deep this went. "All right," he said, keeping his voice even. "I'll check the reports later." He ended the call and exhaled slowly. Greg was either lying or completely out of touch. Either way, it meant one thing Darren couldn't just observe from a distance. He needed to get inside. The thought had been forming in the back of his mind ever since he'd seen the state of the food truck, but now it solidified into a plan. He was going to go undercover as a new employee. It wouldn't be hard. The company always had a little turnover, and with 8 trucks running, hiring was constant. He'd create a fake application, use an alias, and send it straight to Travis. If this guy was as careless as he seemed, he'd probably hire someone without thinking twice. Darren turned back toward the truck, watching the employees move without urgency. Customers waiting longer than they should for orders that would likely disappoint them. He had spent years building something he was proud of. He wasn't about to let it fall apart because of complacency and bad leadership. It was time to get to work. Darren sat in his car, the city's evening glow reflecting off the windshield as he waited for a response. He had sent in an application under the name Danny Carter, using a burner email and a prepaid phone number. Within an hour, a single text popped up from Travis himself, offering him a trial shift the next day. No interview, no questions, just a time and a location. That told Darren everything he needed to know. A manager who hired that fast wasn't screening anyone, which meant he didn't care who worked for him as long as bodies filled the shift. The next afternoon, Darren arrived at the truck wearing a cheap baseball cap and a second-hand hoodie he had picked up from a thrift store. The moment he stepped inside, the heat hit him hard. The ventilation was barely working, and the air smelled like burnt grease. Travis barely glanced up from his phone. He was a bulky guy with a buzz cut and a stained work shirt, leaning against the prep table like he had no intention of moving anytime soon. The only other person inside was a younger employee, arms deep in the sink, scrubbing dishes that looked like they hadn't been properly washed in days. Travis gestured lazily toward a stack of aprons. "Grab one, you're on grill." Darren raised a brow. No training, no safety rundown, just straight to work. He pulled on an apron and moved toward the station, quickly assessing the setup. The griddle was coated in a layer of old grease, the spatulas sitting in a half-filled container of murky water. The prep station to his right was disorganized, with wilted lettuce and half-used sauce bottles scattered around. Travis finally pushed off the counter and wandered toward the small fridge, yanking it open and pulling out a tray of pre-cooked patties. Darren's stomach twisted. He knew exactly what was wrong the moment he saw them. They were grayish, the texture slightly off. These weren't fresh. "How long have those been sitting in there?" Darren asked casually, pretending not to already know the answer. Travis barely looked at him. "They're fine. We cook 'em up, slap some cheese on, and no one knows the difference." Darren kept his face neutral, but inside, his frustration deepened. Pre-cooked patties were against company policy. Every burger was supposed to be made fresh to order. Not only was this lazy, but it was a food safety risk. Customers started arriving, and Melinda showed up just in time to take orders, her expression just as uninterested as it had been the day before. Darren got to work, flipping patties and assembling burgers as quickly as he could while watching how the truck operated. The more he saw, the worse it got. The fry station was running on old oil that hadn't been changed in what smelled like days. The buns were often pulled straight from an open bag without being toasted. And the worst offense, Travis had a habit of wiping his hands on his apron instead of washing them. At one point, a customer returned to the truck, holding up a burger with a frustrated expression. "This is raw in the middle," the man said. Darren turned, watching closely. Travis barely gave the burger a glance before rolling his eyes. "It's fine," he muttered. The customer frowned. "No, it's not. I'm not eating this." Darren saw his opening. "I'll fix it," he said quickly, taking the burger before Travis could argue. He tossed it back onto the griddle and made sure it was properly cooked before handing it back. "Sorry about that." The customer nodded, clearly still annoyed but satisfied enough to walk away. Travis shot Darren a look, annoyed. "You don't need to do all that. People just like to complain." Darren ignored him and kept working. Hours passed, and the truck never slowed down. By the time the dinner rush hit, the small fridge was nearly empty. Darren watched as Travis pulled a second tray of pre-cooked patties from underneath the counter. The smell was off immediately. Darren hesitated before speaking. "Those shouldn't be used." Travis let out a dry laugh. "You new guys always worry too much. It's fine." Darren shook his head. "No, it's not." Travis' expression darkened. "You gonna be a problem." Darren met his gaze. He had seen enough. This wasn't just laziness, it was negligence, and it was happening under his brand's name. He pulled off his apron and took a step back. "Yeah, I am." Then, before anyone could react, Darren reached up and pulled off his baseball cap. Travis' smirk disappeared. His eyes widened slightly as he took a longer look at Darren's face, realization sinking in. Melinda, who had been leaning against the counter, suddenly stood up straighter. The younger employee at the sink froze mid-scrub. Darren let the silence hang for a moment before speaking. "Own this company." Travis' mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Darren crossed his arms. "And I just watched you serve bad food, ignore safety rules, and treat customers like an inconvenience." Travis' expression shifted from surprise to something closer to defensiveness. "Look, man, it's a food truck. It's not a 5-star restaurant. We do what we gotta do to keep up." Darren's voice stayed calm, but there was an edge to it. "No, what we have to do is serve fresh, safe food the way this brand was built to, not cut corners and hope no one notices." He turned his gaze to Melinda. "And customer service is part of the job. Acting like people are a problem isn't how we do things." Melinda's face paled slightly, but she didn't argue. Darren took a slow breath. "I've seen enough. This isn't just a bad day. This is a failure of leadership." He looked directly at Travis. "You're fired." Travis scoffed, shaking his head. "For what? Doing my job." Darren's expression hardened. "You haven't been doing your job. If I have to explain why serving unsafe food and ignoring basic hygiene is a fireable offense, then you shouldn't be here in the first place." Travis looked like he wanted to argue, but Darren wasn't interested in debating. He turned toward the younger employee at the sink. "What's your name?" The kid hesitated before answering. "Ethan." Darren nodded. "You're in charge for the rest of the night. Shut this truck down properly, clean it right, and serve everything fresh. I'll be back in the morning. Ethan's eyes widened. Me? Darren's voice softened slightly. Yeah, you. Travis let out a short laugh. This is ridiculous. Darren didn't even look at him. Get your things and go. Travis muttered something under his breath, but grabbed his bag and left. Darren turned back to the rest of the team. Things are going to change, starting now. He stepped out of the truck, inhaling the cool night air. This wasn't over. There was still a long way to go. But it would be fixed. Because he wasn't letting his company fall apart. Not like this. Darren arrived early the next morning, stepping out of his car as the first light of dawn stretched across the city skyline. The truck sat parked in its usual spot, but something was different. The usual staleness in the air had been replaced by the crisp scent of fresh ingredients. The metal exterior, once streaked with grease stains, gleamed in the soft morning light. Ethan stood outside, wiping down the service counter with a damp cloth. His posture was tense, but there was a quiet determination in his movements. Darren approached, noting the subtle look of apprehension on the young man's face. "How'd it go last night?" Darren asked, keeping his tone even. Ethan straightened. "We cleaned everything top to bottom. Took a while, but it's done right." Darren nodded, stepping up to the truck and peering inside. The difference was immediate. The griddle had been scrubbed down to the steel, the prep station neatly organized, and the fry station no longer reeked of old oil. Even the fridge, which Darren had seen filled with questionable patties the day before, now held properly wrapped, fresh ingredients. "You did all this?" Darren asked. Ethan hesitated. Melinda helped. She wasn't happy about it, but once Travis was gone, she didn't argue much. Darren considered that. He had expected resistance, but it seemed Melinda's attitude had been shaped by Travis' leadership. Without him there, she wasn't openly defiant. That was something he could work with. "You did good," Darren said, "but this is just the start. Things are going to change permanently, not just for a night." Ethan nodded, but there was uncertainty in his eyes. What happens now? Darren exhaled, stepping fully into the truck. "Now, we reset the culture of this place. That means retraining, new expectations, and accountability. Everyone who stays on board has to be willing to do things the right way." Ethan absorbed the words, then gestured toward the food inventory. "I ordered fresh supplies from the main distributor this morning. Figured we shouldn't serve anything from yesterday." That caught Darren off guard. The initiative was impressive. "Smart call," Darren said. "You think you can handle running things for a while?" Ethan hesitated. I don't know everything, but I care. I don't want this place to be a joke." Darren studied him for a moment, then made a decision. "Then you're the new shift lead. Temporary for now, but if you prove yourself, it'll be permanent." Ethan's eyes widened slightly. "Seriously?" "You earned it," Darren said simply. "Now let's get to work." As the morning rush began, Darren worked alongside the team, ensuring every burger was cooked fresh, every order handled with care. He watched as Melinda, while still somewhat detached, put in an effort she hadn't shown before. Without Travis breathing down her neck, her demeanor was less defensive. She wasn't exactly warm, but she wasn't outright dismissive anymore either. By midday, Darren stepped back to observe. The customers seemed noticeably happier. Orders were coming out promptly, fries were served hot, and no one walked away with raw meat. Greg, the district manager, arrived just after noon, his usual confident stride faltering when he spotted Darren behind the grill. His expression flickered with confusion, then concern. "Boss," Greg said, approaching cautiously, "what are you doing here?" Darren wiped his hands on a clean towel and turned to face him fully. "Fixing what you should have caught." Greg's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" Darren gestured toward the truck. This place was a disaster. Bad food, worse service, zero oversight. Either you didn't know or you ignored it. Which is it? Greg's mouth opened, but no words came out immediately. He glanced at Ethan, who was focused on flipping burgers with precision, then at Melinda, who was handling customers without her usual indifference. Travis always reported things were fine, Greg finally said. Darren's expression didn't change, and you never checked. Greg hesitated, then sighed. Should've. I got comfortable trusting the reports. That's not good enough, Darren said evenly. This company grew because I stayed involved. Somewhere along the way, I pulled back too far and people like Travis took advantage. That changes today. Greg shifted uncomfortably. What do you want me to do? Darren studied him for a long moment before replying. You're on probation. If you're staying in this role, you're going to be hands-on. No more trusting second-hand reports. You visit every location regularly, you talk to staff, and you make sure problems don't get buried. Greg nodded, looking more serious than he had in a long time. Understood. Darren turned back toward the truck. Now, let's get this place running the way it was meant to. By the time the evening rush hit, the difference was undeniable. Customers left satisfied, employees worked with purpose, and the food was exactly what it should be: fresh, well-made, and worth coming back for. As Darren stepped away from the truck, watching Ethan manage the team with growing confidence, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: pride in the people behind his brand. This wasn't just about fixing one location. It was about rebuilding everything from the ground up, making sure no truck under his name ever fell into neglect again. And this time, he wouldn't be watching from a distance. Darren leaned against a concrete barrier near the truck, arms crossed as he watched the evening rush unfold. Ethan moved with precision, calling out orders and double-checking each plate before it left the window. Melinda, while not exactly cheerful, handled customers efficiently, her tone more neutral than outright dismissive. The shift had a rhythm now, something it had lacked the day before. The difference was stark, but Darren knew this was just the beginning. A single day of improvement didn't mean everything was fixed. Habits took time to change, and trust both from employees and customers had to be rebuilt. A man in a suit approached the truck, flipping through his phone as he waited in line. Darren recognized him immediately: Marcus, one of the company's longtime suppliers. The truck relied on his distribution company for fresh ingredients, and they had worked together for years during the early days. Marcus glanced up from his phone, did a double take, then let out a short breath. He stepped out of line and walked straight to Darren. I thought that was you, Marcus said, lowering his voice. Didn't expect to see the owner of the brand running grill duty. Darren gave a half nod, keeping his eyes on the truck. Had to see things for myself. Marcus followed his gaze. So, what'd you find? Darren exhaled. More than I wanted to. Bad management, food safety violations, customer service issues, the works. Marcus let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. Can't say I'm shocked. I've been noticing smaller orders from this truck for months. Figured they were cutting corners somewhere. Darren's jaw tightened slightly. That was another oversight he hadn't caught. If the truck had been ordering less, it meant they had either been stretching supplies too far or using alternative, lower-quality ingredients. Neither option was acceptable. You should have called me, Darren said, glancing at Marcus. Marcus gave him a knowing look. Would you have believed me, or would you have assumed everything was running fine like your report said? Darren didn't answer right away. He knew the truth. He had trusted the numbers, the reports, the filtered updates from managers who told him what he wanted to hear. Stepping away from the day-to-day had made sense when the company expanded, but now he saw the cost of that distance. He nodded once. Fair point. Marcus pocketed his phone. So what's next? Darren watched as Ethan instructed another employee to wipe down the prep station between orders, something that hadn't been happening before. The kid was stepping up. First, I fix this truck, Darren said. Then, I make sure the rest are running the way they should be. Marcus let out a low hum, considering that. If you need my help, say the word. I'd rather supply a company that actually cares about quality. Darren appreciated that. Marcus had been with him since the early days, back when he had only one truck and a dream of turning it into something bigger. People like him were part of the foundation. Start by making sure every truck is getting the best ingredients, Darren said. If they try to cut orders or go cheap, send it straight to me. Marcus grinned. Now that I can do. As Marcus moved back into line, Darren pushed off the barrier and walked toward the truck. The evening rush was slowing, but there was still a steady stream of customers. He stepped inside, catching the tail end of Ethan giving instructions to another worker about portion sizes. Ethan glanced up, hesitating for a second before speaking. Everything holding up. Darren nodded. Better than yesterday, but we're not done. Ethan set down the spatula he had been holding. I figured. Darren leaned against the counter. Tomorrow, I'm bringing in a corporate trainer. Everyone gets retrained food safety, customer service, the works. If anyone doesn't want to get on board, they can leave now. Ethan didn't flinch. That makes sense. Darren studied him for a moment. The kid had potential. He had stepped up when things were falling apart, taken responsibility without being asked. You planning to stick around long-term? Darren asked. Ethan hesitated, glancing toward the register where Melinda was handing out change. I don't know. I didn't think this job would be anything more than temporary. Darren understood that. Most food truck jobs weren't careers, they were stepping stones. But leadership was hard to find, and Ethan had it. If you stay, there's opportunity here, Darren said. Not just running this truck, but maybe something bigger. Ethan's eyebrows lifted slightly. Bigger. Darren nodded. We need people who actually care. If this company is going to grow the right way, I need leaders who make sure what happened here doesn't happen anywhere else. Ethan didn't answer right away. He seemed to be weighing the idea, considering it in a way he hadn't before. I'll think about it, he said finally. Darren accepted that. He didn't need an answer today. The night wrapped up with a full breakdown of the truck, something Darren insisted on overseeing personally. Every surface was wiped, every station properly stocked for the next shift. As the last employee left, Darren lingered for a moment, looking at the truck under the glow of the streetlights. It was just one location, but it represented something bigger. This was his company, and he was taking it back.